how do we take this ancient craft of storytelling and translate it for the blockchain era in the same way that he did for the mobile era. So what we're doing is like building this global IP graph where you have a source IP, and then it's almost like a constellation of derivatives, and each of the nodes are IPs, and each of the edges in that graph are economic and legal relationships. They love the idea of sovereignty. They love the idea of control. They love the idea of a global IP Legoland where anyone can monetize and use their work, because creators want reputation, they want reach, and they want revenue. And that's what Story provides, right? But we give them the control and the keys. And we built out the module architecture in such a way that we expect and we encourage developers to bring their own modules.
Welcome to Web3 Galaxy Brain. My name is Nicholas. Each week, I sit down with some of the brightest people building Web3 to talk about what they're working on right now. My guest today is Jason Zhao, co-founder of Story Protocol. Story Protocol has raised over $50 million venture dollars to build an on-chain protocol for intellectual property licensing. In this episode, Jason explains what's wrong with IP licensing today and how putting licenses on-chain will enable more people to create derivative works without tedious and often infeasible paperwork and flow revenue royalties up to licensors on-chain. We also dive into the technical details, and Jason explains how Story uses NFTs to represent individual IP assets, and that these NFTs will control ERC 6551 token-bound accounts where IP owners can plug in licensing, royalties, and dispute resolution modules. It was great getting a chance to talk to Jason about everything Story Protocol. I hope you enjoy the show. As always, this show is provided as entertainment and does not constitute legal, financial, or tax advice or any form of endorsement or suggestion. Crypto has risks, and you alone are responsible for doing your research and making your own decisions. Jason, welcome to Web3 Galaxy Brain.
Hi, Nicholas. Great to be here.
Awesome. So today we're going to talk all about Story Protocol, which I'm very excited to learn more about. Maybe first off, how did the idea for Story Protocol come about?
Yeah, so Story Protocol, what we're doing is basically building the world's programmable IP layer. And we're really focused on basically building infrastructure layer that allows creators and applications to bring creative assets on chain. And when we think about creative assets, it's anything from characters to voice to name, image, likeness to TikTok videos or even full-length movies, right? So we think about this whole world of intellectual property and of ideas. And the way that the idea came about is really taking a look at the potential of blockchain and seeing that. For me, I'm a technical person. I think about what technology can do, right? So I was very interested in this technology blockchain because I studied philosophy, and in particular political philosophy, and I started reading these white papers. And I just found that the breadth of ideas and political ideologies reflected in technology is very interesting. So there's the early libertarians in the form of Vitalik and the cypherpunks and Satoshi, but then around 2020 there was a lot of conversation around DAOs and experiencing governance, and of course there's just a global market. There's a lot of trading going on, so there's like pure capitalism, and I found that very exciting from an intellectual perspective, and that's how I kind of got into blockchain. And then I started looking around at the space, and what I saw was a lot of financial infrastructure, right? I think Bitcoin is infrastructure for immutable money. Ethereum is a sort of parallel financial ecosystem, and stable coins are really like a global settlement layer. And all of that was extremely exciting to me. But at the same time, most people don't spend their time on Robinhood. They don't spend their time on Charles Schwab. Like, people really spend their time on Netflix, on TikTok. They consume culture and they create culture. And that's what makes us human. And I just didn't see too much innovation compared to the financial side of things with blockchain. But I felt like there's so much that blockchain could offer to the world of creativity and to the world of culture. And NFTs are a great start, but in many cases, they're sort of still pointers to static media files. And there's no way to get the composability that is so key to blockchain and its promise in the world of culture as it is in DeFi, right? Because in DeFi, I can take a dollar bill, bring it on chain, it's USDC, it's USDT, make a swap on Uniswap, get ETH, stake that ETH on Lido, get staked ETH, put that into a lending protocol, get compound staked ETH, or what have you, right? And that all happens in this parallel financial ecosystem without any permission. But if I wanted to, let's say, create a comic with a Pudgy and someone else's Bored Ape, and how would I do that? I would probably have to, I would have to read my license. I had to read their license. I'd have to contact them in person. We'd have to get lawyers on both sides. We'd negotiate a deal, and I'd trust them to share the revenue with me. And the resulting byproduct wouldn't be on chain. So it's almost like if I wanted to make a DEX swap, I had to call my banker and find a counterparty. They had to call their banker to execute a trade, and we had to KYC. It almost defeats the whole point, right? So that was kind of the problem that we saw. And at the same time, we're looking at the outside world of creators without blockchain, and Hollywood is struggling. Digital creators are finding it very difficult to monetize. And I think monetization and coordinating incentives is a superpower of blockchain, right? So the combination of the problems that creators are facing in the traditional world and the lack of solutions invested in the blockchain space kind of made it sort of almost inevitable. We felt like that there needs to be an IP infrastructure that creates programmable IP and IP Legos in the same way that DeFi created money Legos.
Yeah, this is kind of one of my key questions for you, which is what makes Story Protocol better than just the kind of crop of NFTs that were putting their licensing restrictions into the like comments in their Solidity contracts or what have you? What is the problem that Story Protocol is trying to solve that just like writing a comment with a legal agreement in it into an NFT contract doesn't solve?
Yeah, it's a great question. So essentially, I think NFTs provide a great foundation, and the foundation that they provide is a sort of digital scarcity, right? And that's important because just abstracting away blockchain for a little bit, like what is IP fundamentally and why is blockchain suited to serve it? IP is very different from physical property. Physical property, naturally scarce, right? I want a beachside property. The beach is only a mile long. There's 5 mansions that can be built around it. The mansions are going to be valuable. But ideas are not that way, right? Like if I create a character or I have an idea for like building this awesome plane or something and I share it with you, Nicholas, like you could go build that plane. You could tell someone else about it. They could go build that plane. I mean, it's not like a beach, right? So that's why blockchain is interesting because blockchains provide provable scarcity in this era of abundance, right? And especially with AI, like making content production, Hollywood level content production almost go to zero. Like content's going to be extremely abundant. And in order for anyone to be incentivized to create content, there needs to be scarcity, which is why blockchains are really important. NFTs provide a foundation for provable scarcity. So that's why they're important. But like where they're limited and where Story Protocol and programmable IP really takes the next step is that right now it's extremely static and single player, right? Like I mentioned in the Zuki example or the Pudgy example, if I want to do anything with an NFT, like I go back to the world of pen and paper legal world, right? And it's almost like what we're trying to do is very similar to USDC, right? USDC, you on-ramp a dollar bill, and on-chain, no one thinks about the dollar bill. They just think of it's an ERC20 token, and I can do whatever I want with it. But then if I want to, I can off-ramp it and get a dollar bill. That's very important, right? What we're trying to do is bring the world of creative IP on-chain, on-ramp it, and then let you do anything you want with it in a multiplayer way, right? So what Story lets you do is you can bring any asset on-chain. It's represented as sort of a unique form of NFT. That's how our protocol works. And then you can set, as a creator or as an application registering the IP, you can set the terms for how other people can engage with that. And that's really important because right now I don't know how to, like, I can look at this image and I can see that it's a token, but that's all I can do, right? But with Story, you can almost see like an API for rights wrapped around every piece of content on the internet represented as an NFT. And so anyone, any developer, any app, any AI model that wants to use or remix or monetize a piece of content, they can see the terms that the creator or the application has set. So that application might say, look, you can use this character I've created if you pay me 0.5 ETH and you share 50% of the revenues. And if I agree to that, I can call an API, or as a creator, I can just get a license and use that IP without having to ask, without needing any intermediaries. And if I create a derivative work, let's say I add a hat onto the character, then that is also registered as a derivative. So what we're doing is like building this global IP graph where you have a source IP and then it's almost like a constellation of derivatives, and each of the nodes are IPs and each of the edges in that graph are economic and legal relationships. So if one of the children of my children makes revenue, then all of that can be tracked and waterfalled up to me. And that happens automatically, and any single app can leverage this graph, right? So it's almost like the way Farcaster or Lens or Decentralized Social is focusing on any app can solve the cold start problem when it comes to bootstrapping profiles in a social graph. Story is basically allowing any content or consumer app, whether it's crypto or not, to bootstrap a content graph, and almost like a Library of Alexandria on chain. But it's not just, hey, this is the media file. It's actually, here's the media file and here's how I can use it by calling a simple API and monetize on it.
So as compared to some of the 2020, 2021 era NFT on-chain IP rights, which maybe conferred rights to the holder of the token, but then had all the legal agreements thenceforth happen off-chain. This is really bringing all of that activity on-chain so that it can be both queried, licensed, and even revenues streamed back to the original holders through a series of derivation steps and remixes entirely on-chain, not requiring recourse to the existing legal system. Got it. So let's talk a little bit about how this actually works. How does Story Protocol solve this problem?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the way that Story works at a high level, and we can go deeper into any part of the stack, right? But basically, it's a set of Solidity smart contracts that we built out over the course of 2 years. We've made a lot of improvements, but right now, the way that it works is that there's essentially 2 components. what we call at a high level nouns and verbs. For a more developer oriented audience, right, this is basically state and functions. And so essentially what we've defined is a global smart contract based IP repository. Think about it almost as a Git for IPs. So that's the nouns. It's how do you actually represent these diverse forms of intellectual properties, anything from a video to a visual character to a prose work to even someone's voice on chain, and give it the appropriate metadata standard such that it can compose with any other IP. So you can, let's say I can create a sort of like multimedia experience where I have a character and then I bring in my own voice to animate the character. That would be almost like a composition using two IP Legos. One is the character and one is the voice, right? And they need to be able to compose with each other. And so on the nouns or the state side, we've defined this sort of smart contract repository as well as a metadata standard that allows us to represent IP and all the associated metadata on chain. So that's where the state is stored. And the way we implement that is we essentially use a very special story protocol version of a 6551 account. So every single NFT, new or existing, right? Like if it's artwork from a museum, we just mint an NFT, attach a story token bound account to that NFT that has all that metadata. And if it's an existing NFT, we can work with that as well. So all the IP that's already on chain, like if it's a Bored Ape or if it's something that's been minted on Zora or Foundation, like we can already register that and it's backwards compatible, right? Just by attaching this story token bound account. So that's the state side of things. And then this is the so what about why do I care if it's on story protocol? Like, why do I want to program my IP? Well, the reason why is because of the verbs, right? Which are the modules. And so we've built these stateless modules, which are essentially like interfaces. And you can think about them as somewhat similar to like a module on Lens, like Lens has collect module, they have follow module, they have all these different modules. Same thing with IP. So every IP gets superpowers when you register on story. You have a licensing module that allows you to attach a real legal license to your IP. And that's a license that we've spent a lot of time and effort creating with some of the top lawyers in the world so that every IP registered on story, just like I said with the USDC example, gets the protection of legal backing without having to worry about that because it's all on chain. So you have a licensing module that allows you to set licensing terms and anyone can see those terms and permissionlessly generate a license for your IP and pay you for that work. There's also a royalties module that allows you to essentially, if any of your derivatives or any children that have used your IP, if they receive revenue, the royalty module helps flow that revenue back to you and tracks the sort of obligations across this IP graph. And there's a lot of other modules that we built that basically, once you register on Story, any IP has access to. So that's kind of how the overall structure works is we have a sort of global database, shared data standard implemented using the token bound account, a story token bound account that almost gives everyone like a story profile or every piece of IP a story profile. And then that gives you access to the set of modules that unlock capabilities for that IP.
So I think it might be helpful to go through an example like you kind of gave a hint of just there. Let's say we were to turn this podcast into an NFT and maybe we're both somehow owners of it. If we were to go through the life cycle of the process and then someone were to make a derivative, maybe we could walk through each of them and that way it'll help the listener get a kind of idea. So the first thing we would do is mint an NFT, assuming that there isn't one already. My first question when we get to that step is, it's interesting that you've chosen to make NFTs such an important part of the protocol, especially considering that it applies also to things that are not strictly NFTs. Like my impression is that you're, as you mentioned with the idea of painting, your target audience is not exclusively crypto native artists, but also any kind of IP that maybe originated off chain and maybe isn't particularly monetized via NFT sales. So why is it that the NFT has been chosen as this like core IP asset component if some of the target audience, maybe even most of the target audience, are not principally interested in crypto?
Yeah, so let me answer the second part of that question, and then I'll give a concrete example. There's two parts to the first half, or there's two parts of the first part of your question that I'm going to answer. So let me just break this down. The first part is why blockchain, right? Like we actually work with, for example, apps that are fully Web2. They have 2.5 million users. They've reached product market fit. They're registering 10 million IPs, right? And eventually we'll support all of them. And so why blockchain? And then secondly, if blockchain, why NFTs, right? So let me answer that in sort of order. Why blockchain? It's really important. We're asking people to essentially register one of the most valuable assets in the world on chain, right? And many companies, studios, individual creators, their entire like net worth and value is based on IP. And we're asking them to register that on Story and to allow us to help them sort of monetize and license their IP, right? And so if we were a centralized entity, like a company, let's just call it like Story Co. or something like that, like a holding company where people register their IP, then number one, we would be almost like custodians and we'd almost replicate the intermediary problem that we had before, which is that someone needs to sort of manage, whether it's a lawyer or a holding company needs to manage your IP for you, and you need to trust them to essentially do the right thing. And now we have to create integrations with every single app as an individual company. And blockchain is really important because essentially allows us to create an almost autonomous legal system on chain, right? An autonomous like IP Legoland on chain, where we can say, hey, you as Disney, as Netflix, as this Web2 company, you can trust us with your IP, or as a creator, because we're not in charge of it. Like, we can't tamper with your IP. We can't tamper with the terms that you've set. And also the license that we've created, it's not a license with Story, the company. It's a license with anyone that uses your IP. So you are the holder of legal rights, and you will always remain the holder. And we can't change the rules of the game just because maybe we're not earning enough, or because we're dissatisfied with some of the IP that's been registered. So it really goes to this idea of sovereignty.
In your experience talking to prospective customers or users of the protocol, do you find that they're excited about that aspect, or they're more put off by the general reputation of crypto currently? Surely not in the long term, but do they like the idea of having this kind of decentralized protocol underlying a public registry of their IP? Or do they prefer the idea of having it private and maybe more traditionally managed?
Well, this is a very interesting question, because they love the idea of sovereignty. They love the idea of control. They love the idea of a global IP Legoland where anyone can monetize and use their work, because creators want reputation, they want reach, and they want revenue. And that's what Story provides, right? But we give them the control and the keys. So it's almost like a Shopify, right? Like, Shopify is not, like, if you're selling on Amazon, you're beholden to Amazon. But if you create a Shopify store, I mean, they can still do some certain things because they're Web2, but like the idea, the principle is that, hey, I have my own storefront, I do whatever I want with it, and Shopify just gives me the tools, right? So the story is more like Shopify, and they love that idea. And when we work with Web2 companies and big Hollywood creators that they don't really care about blockchain, they love the principles, and we don't pitch them the technology, right? Actually, we've built UI that abstracts away all of the wallet architecture, that abstracts away all of the gas, all of the, things that would really, because these Web2 apps, they already have users. They don't want to see a wallet pop up one day into their normal workflow, and that would confuse them. So we abstract all of that away, and the technology just works, but they love the principles behind the technology. And so I think that's kind of a gap that maybe many in the industry have faced, and we're starting to cross now, is like, can we just communicate the value to people that don't care about crypto, and then just abstract away all of the technical intricacies? So that's what we've tried to do with more traditional partners.
That maybe starts to answer the question about why NFTs are so fundamental. Each piece of intellectual property is unique, and to the users of the protocol, the creators who are using it, they maybe don't even have to really care about whether it's 6551, NFT, et cetera. It's technical detail. Exactly. And you nailed it on the head. NFTs represent unique assets, and creativity is almost definitionally unique. Otherwise, it would just be like a replication rather than creation. So that's exactly why we use NFTs. I'm curious about you register an NFT, you have an NFT, you register it as an IP asset in this registry that Story Protocol provides, and that creates an IP account, if I understand correctly, which is this 6551 token bound account. So basically the NFT, let's say you're Azuki, or maybe this podcast episode, now owns, whoever holds that NFT can now control the smart account associated with that NFT. So if the NFT moves hands, then whoever holds that NFT will have control of the smart account. This, what do you call it? Story Protocol bound account? Mm-hmm.
Story Protocol token. Yeah. Story bound account. Yeah.
Story bound account. So, and then what is the purpose of having this smart account? Why choose to have a smart account? Why not just have like all this metadata and details just inside of the smart contract in the first place? Why does it need to live inside of a smart account that belongs to the NFT rather than just living inside of the Story Protocol registry?
Yeah, so in our first design, we actually had everything in the sort of ERC 721, and that's the cleanest, right? I think that's the most simple. But one thing and one of the whole points of why we started Story in the first place is composability, right? And so if you have your own standard, you're not backwards compatible. And so all of this existing creativity that's on chain, like, you need to remint it, or it just doesn't work with Story, and that to us was unacceptable. We wanted to be, no matter what happens, we wanted to be compatible with all the creativity in the world, because our ambition is to be, serving as you know, like Web2 users, traditional Hollywood creators, in addition to crypto users. And so all of the work that's already been done on the NFT standard is really important, and all of the existing IP that's already been imported on chain is also really important. And so for us, we wanted to think about what is the most flexible, adaptable, and future-proof way to ensure that any digital asset that represents IP can live on Story. And the most intuitive idea for us was, why don't we create a wrapper, right? Instead of forcing people to use an underlying standard, why don't we create a wrapper around that standard so that anyone who creates an NFT in a game or who has already created an NFT can use Story and leverage its benefits. And then for incoming, future users who don't care about NFTs, we just mint an NFT on their behalf, right? So they don't have to think about, what is an NFT? How do I represent this artwork as an NFT? I've never heard of this. We just do it for them. And we have an SDK that does the entire process in one step. If you're bringing something off chain, we mint the NFT for you. We attach the account. It all happens in one seamless registration. But the idea here is really to maximize composability.
Out of curiosity, what chain are you doing these sponsored transactions on?
Yeah, so right now we are really focused on the Ethereum community. And so we had some experiments with partners like Lens. And so right now, basically the way that we think about Story is we want to support our partners wherever they are. And we believe that IP lives everywhere. So right now we're relatively chain agnostic. In the future, we may explore ways to kind of allow more atomic composability across chains. But we're basically focused, we're very partner focused. And so we have deployments on testnet across a variety of chains.
Because I guess ultimately you might want to have a single, or at least the affordance so that people can query IP regardless of what chain the NFTs live on and the smart accounts live on.
Yeah, that is definitely the end goal. And that's something that we're thinking about. And so we've kind of proven out that, hey, individual, apps really, really benefit from Story. And the next step is, can we actually, again, continue to make steps towards this promise of composability? Because right now you can have intra-chain composability, but it's hard to have cross-chain composability. And we want this to be a seamless experience where if I want to create a comic with a Pudgy Penguins on Ethereum mainnet and a Claynosaurus on Solana, that we could do that.
Got it. So I guess also having these smart accounts lets you define some modules, but also over time introduce new modules or let people permissionlessly create their own modules that could be associated with an IP asset, I presume?
Yes, the latter is really what we're focused on in the long run, which is, hey, we started out with royalty and licensing, which we think are pretty core, but the mission is to really decentralize this, open source this, and we built out the module architecture in such a way that we expect and we encourage developers to bring their own modules. And so we think that, IP is like remixing, licensing are really just a start, but there's a world of ideas that we'd have no idea like what people are going to create. And we want to allow third-party developers to build their own modules. And we can imagine almost a module marketplace where people can create really cool functionality around IP and actually get compensated for having created that.
Okay, so let's dive into these modules a little bit more. So the first one is the licensing module. And I suppose that's almost by default, at least at this stage, given that there's no alternative modules to do licensing. So if you're registering an IP asset, you're probably going to use the licensing module. And it uses this programmable IP license that you've developed. Can you add a little color on what this PIL, or I suppose it's a bit redundant to call it a PIL license, but what this programmable IP license, what does it involve? What does it solve for someone that they might otherwise have to deal with in the kind of TradFi IP space? How does it relate to existing kinds of IP protections?
Yeah, so the PIL, we kind of call it internally, is basically, think about it as, there's two ways to think about it. The first is that it is essentially an on-ramp on-chain for IP. And the reason why we need a legal on-ramp is because IP is a legal concept. And so the PIL is basically the way that we ensure that every IP on Story Protocol, it's not just purely on-chain, but it also has off-chain protection. And that's really important for creators because let's say I mint something on, let's say, Zora, and it's connected with Story, and I set my licensing terms on-chain. And so people can monetize my IP on-chain and it's protected on-chain, but then it gets really popular and I want to take it to a studio and they ask, okay, so it's Disney, they don't really care about NFTs, and you say, oh, I have these on-chain terms that I've set, you have to follow them. They won't care, right? So the idea is that every IP registered on Story is protected by the PIL, and there's a one-to-one correspondence between the on-chain terms that you set using our API and the selections that we automatically make for you on the PIL. So the PIL is like a very, very flexible license. Almost think about it, each term has like a drop-down menu. So there's a term for what's the upfront fee. There's a drop-down menu that you can set. What is the royalty share? There's a drop-down menu on the license that you can select. And so there's like 10 or 15 of those terms that allow you to have a legal license that's one-to-one with the on-chain reality that we're making. And so this vision of code is law and law is code is something that we're really trying to realize, where you as a developer or as a crypto user just think about the code, but the law just works for you. Or if you only care about the law, you can trust that the code is enforcing that law. And so the PIL is this almost like off-ramp or on-ramp into the legal world, whereas we are really operating in the on-chain world. We think that world is more efficient. So that's one way to think about it. The other way, another analogy that we use is basically, it's a little bit like a YC safe for Story. And so it's a kind of one size fits all license for all types of media. And we spent a lot of time thinking about how to make it flexible. But in the future, we actually plan on allowing people to bring their own license. So big brands or individual apps, they might have their own license they want to use. We think the pill probably covers 99% of use cases, but if people want to bring their own license, or you can even imagine like lawyers creating licenses and selling them and allowing people to use them on Story for a small fee, like that's possible as well. So we have this open system where people can register their license on Story and then map those to terms in our smart contracts in our licensing module. And the beauty of doing that, the power of doing that is that whenever you want to compose IPs together and see if they're compatible, and you can use 2 different IPs or 4 different IPs, or if you're creating like a Smash Bros style game, it's maybe like 30 different characters that you want to license. Instead of having to talk to 30 different teams and then make sure that each of them are compatible with each other by like putting 30 legal docs side by side, you can just let our smart contracts check the compatibility for you. Basically what we've built is this universal compatibility engine. So we can check on chain whether you can actually bring these IPs together, and if so, like what do you owe everyone, right, upfront and royalty wise, and you don't have to worry about that. So anyone can make the next Avengers or the next Smash Bros by making a series of clicks rather than by having to be one of the biggest corporations in the world and have massive legal team talk to other massive legal teams.
Would you call that liquid licensing?
Yeah. Actually, this is a great term, and I think we might actually use that, liquid licensing. One of the things we think about is, hey, beyond licensing, like we're not just a licensing protocol, right? Because at the end of the day, one of the big unlocks of crypto is creating liquidity, right? And so you mentioned this term liquid. We think about that beyond just licensing in terms of IPs are real world assets. Actually, they're the real world assets that are most uniquely suited for blockchains because of the fact that they have no natural scarcity. They need blockchains to provide scarcity. And so, it's a $2 trillion asset class, which is, I think right now around the market cap of all of crypto combined, right? And it's the most illiquid asset class. So you have $2 trillion that people don't even, like as a creator, I don't even know I have IP. Like that term is foreign to me. If I'm creating something on Dolly, that's IP, but I don't know I have it. The only people that can do anything with it are these massive studios and conglomerates. And so it's like extremely illiquid, it's extremely opaque. And so for a lot of creators, just having the ability to bring that IP on chain into this global marketplace where anyone can use it and license it and trade it is going to be a huge unlock. And so that's probably the first phase of Story, is just tokenizing the world's creativity, bringing it on chain, making it liquid and legible. And then let's say for every 1,000 IPs that get tokenized on Story, maybe 100 of them get licensed or 100 of them get remixed, and then maybe 10 of them get royalties, right? So not every IP is going to be licensed, and you can use Story for things beyond just licensing. I think the most powerful unlock for people in the early days is just going to be tokenization. And that's very powerful in and of itself because it provides liquidity. But to your point on liquid licensing, every license generated Story is also an NFT. So you can imagine a marketplace for licenses. You can imagine IPFi or DeFi protocols that allow you to take in either IPs as collateral or licenses of that IP as collateral. And you can now create this parallel pseudo-creative, pseudo-financial ecosystem, right? Like both creative and financial, that really unlocks this asset class in a way that just wasn't possible before.
So we might say, okay, we're going to turn this podcast episode into an IP asset, and then we're going to maybe create some shares of ownership that could be sold, or we could take a loan against some portion of the revenues generated by derivative works, and then have whoever purchases those either, taking it as collateral, or maybe if we tokenize it, fractionalize it as a fungible or something, we could distribute the revenues that we receive from derivative works of our product up to people who maybe allow us to fund the next production in advance by giving us some kind of investment to own a part of the IP or even the whole thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can give like a radical end-to-end example of just like how flexible Story can be, just to finally go back to your question like 30 minutes ago. I think one way to think about this is let's just start even before the podcast. Like we all own IP, and I genuinely mean that because you have a voice and I have a voice, right? Like our voices your voice is more valuable than mine because you're a podcaster. And so people like hearing your voice. My voice is probably worthless. But anyways, let's just say I tokenize my voice and your voice, and you tokenize your voice as IP. So we register on Story. We set our terms for like how much is my voice worth, how much do people have to pay to use it. And so let's say we get together, or let's say I don't even know you, Nicholas. I just like your voice. So I'm going to pay you 0.1 ETH because that's what you've said on your terms. I don't need to talk to you. I just click a button on some front end, back end API call. And now I have a license to use your voice. And obviously I can use my own voice because I register, I'm the owner. And I use AI to create a podcast where we are talking to each other. Maybe this whole thing is AI generated.
I'm going to be the spokesperson of the next Story
right,
protocol.
Exactly. And maybe this, you never know. If you're listening to this, maybe this is actually the real example. Maybe this is all generated by AI. So we use a video AI that licenses our voices to create this podcast, right? And so now let's say I have this podcast, which is itself a derivative of both of our voices. You can imagine a graph growing. I have my voice, I have a license to your voice. Those are two nodes. And then I have this podcast that I've created with our two voices. That's like a third IP, right? So now this is the sort of source or the child IP of these two parents. And let's say that, this podcast blows up, people are collecting it or they're minting it or somehow it receives revenue. You would receive whatever you set as your terms. You would receive 50% of the revenue. I would receive 50% of the revenue. All of that would happen automatically. And to get it even more radical, like you can imagine a third version of the scenario where actually, because I couldn't finance I couldn't finance my access to the AI that would create this video, I could actually take out my IP, put it in somewhere, like take out my voice and use it as collateral in a DeFi protocol to get a loan, right? To get a loan to finance the creation of this AI podcast. And then once this AI podcast generates revenue, I can pay off that loan that's collateralized on my own IP, right? So now you can sort of imagine these really, really interesting mechanics, both financial and creative. And especially with AI lowering the bar for creativity, it's such a massive opportunity. And right now it's just a huge issue because you've seen like Scarlett Johansson have her voice being used by OpenAI. You've seen Drake and The Weeknd have their voice be used in creation of like remixes that have gone to number one on SoundCloud. You see Harry Potter remixes like Harry Potter and the Style of Balenciaga on YouTube that are getting tens of millions of views. And it's a total lose-lose situation for J.K. Rowling, for the person who spent hours remixing Harry Potter. Like none of them are earning anything. It's an antagonistic lose-lose relationship. But with story and AI, like that becomes a positive sum relationship where you're happy that I licensed your voice because I created this podcast using your voice, but you also earned and you also got reach and you also got reputation. And so that's a much more sustainable future for creativity in the era of AI than this current like antagonistic system. Because currently the legal system is pen and paper. It can't scale to the speed and scale of the internet. So right now it's just like a cease and desist whack-a-mole. Like don't do that, don't do that, don't do that. But the internet can't be stopped and it's fundamentally inevitable. And so given that inevitability, can we create an IP sort of infrastructure, underlying system that allows you to monetize in the age of AI?
Now, you mentioned an example a moment ago about like Disney saying, for example, we don't care about blockchain particularly. But if let's say Disney was interested in some character that emerged that had been minted, registered as an IP asset on Story and had a PIL or pill, then like I assume those are kind of irrevocable, right? If Disney says we don't really like this pill, we want some different deal, is there anything that a creator can do once they've registered it as an IP asset? Because presumably they can't go back and change the license, given that other derivative works may have sort of already engaged with it on the basis of that existing license, right?
Yeah, so it's actually very powerful what people can do and the terms they can set. It's very expressive. So let me give you an example where it would be irrevocable, and then another where it would be. So if Disney registered, let's say Mickey Mouse on chain, they set some terms and you generate a license, Nicholas, with those terms. And then they just got cold feet and they said, no, actually, I don't want to do that deal anymore. They can't do that because you've already paid for the license. You already have the license. That license NFT, that liquid license is yours, right? So you can do whatever you want with it. Obviously following the terms of license. But let's say they generate a few licenses in that way and they realize, okay, this is not a fair deal for us. We want to change all the terms for future licenses, or we want to give tiered licenses. So if I know you, if you're Warner Brothers, I'm going to give you a much better deal. If you're a random person on the internet, I'm going to make it really expensive, right? So they can start tweaking the terms, and you can even imagine on-chain primitives like allow lists coming into play. Like you can set that on-chain where, look, if you are in this list of addresses, you get this deal. If you're not, you get that deal, right? So all future deals can be changed.
So I could append exemptions. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Because, in the same way an IP owner, like if I do one deal, it doesn't, like I can't change that deal, but I can change all my future deals. Maybe that deal wasn't a good one and I want to change my mind. Like for future deals, I can change the terms. I can also have granular terms for different classes of people. And so anything that can be expressed in software can basically be expressed in these terms. And it can become pretty powerful in that way.
But it might be difficult if I wanted to create like an exclusive, if Disney was like, okay, we want to option your NFT character, but we only want to do it if we're going to be, we don't want Warner Brothers to go make a movie with the same character or some crappy YouTube channel to make, videos with the same character. So we want an exclusive license. It might be difficult to walk back the irrevocable like liquid licensing aspects of prior versions of the pill. So you are kind of committing to some amount of liquid licensing, right?
Yes. Any decisions that have been made and done on chain previously, you're kind of committed to because you signed a contract and that's going to be enforced. But in the future with different people or after the existing license expires, you can sort of update your beliefs and update that on chain.
Okay. Is there some notion of like temporal notion built into the pill? Or there can be?
Yeah, this is not currently something that we support, but we're adding this feature where licenses can basically like, essentially there's a tag that flips on, right, after a certain period of time so that they are temporary. But because we're really focused on creating liquidity and this, I mean, I love this term, liquid licensing, like it's hard to imagine a licensed NFT being used in a DeFi protocol when the DeFi protocol needs to now manage risk around, oh, this collateral just disappeared because the license expired and this person maliciously put in like an expiring license as collateral. So we wanted to kind of let the ecosystem develop and see how people use things and then add more complexity and more expressivity based on, you know, a safe foundation.
Okay, I know you don't have ages to talk, and I have too many questions. So let's do like lightning round. How do royalties work? If I install the royalties module, I mean I know that there's like some notion of ERC20s in the royalties module, but if I create a derivative NFT, for example, like I suppose there's two classes of derivatives I can create. Ones that are on chain, where the revenues are on chain, where you can imagine it's still up to me in my derivative work to actually honor the terms of the agreement that I signed up for using the protocol, but all of the sort of revenues can flow through queries to the protocol to find out who's owed what. I can execute the royalties and sort of flow them up the tree of derivative works. But if they're happening off chain, then not only do I have to voluntarily do it, but also the sort of fact of it being executed, the fact of my derivative being created as some merchandise or something, is not in the chain. So in each of these cases, how does the royalties module work? And I guess how does enforcement work also?
Yeah, great question. I'm going to try to talk as fast as I can because it's a lightning round, but these are very big, thorny questions. So let me do my best to be succinct. How does royalties work? The first part of the question, the simplest view I can give is that you're right. We use ERC20 royalty tokens, which again can participate in DeFi, right? Like I have this token, it gives me a claim over some of the royalties, right? So there's a fixed number of tokens that are created per IP, and the royalty module essentially allows you to distribute those tokens in a way that represents the royalty share. So if you want to keep 100% of those tokens, then you don't give out any royalties. If I give you, Nicholas, 10% of my token supply for this IP, then you have a share for 10% of the royalties. It interacts closely with the licensing module because when you set your terms for the licensing module, you might have some royalty terms. And so the royalty module automatically essentially airdrops the right amount of royalty tokens to those people that you've done the deal with. And so that you don't have to manage that yourself, or you don't have to trust that the person's going to give you the royalty tokens after the license has been generated. So there is an interaction between the licensing module, which can dictate the royalty module and the distribution of those tokens. So that's high level how the royalty module works.
If it's let's just say for the on-chain example, just because it'll be simpler to imagine, or I guess in both cases, the idea is that any derivative works would reference the ownership of the ERC20 in order to decide who to allocate revenues to, be it on-chain or off-chain? Okay.
Yes, and so you can imagine a situation where I have a deal with someone to get 20% of the royalties. So when that deal struck, when that license is generated, I get airdrop 20% of that supply, the royalty tokens for that IP. But then I'm like, I don't want this anymore. Like I want to sell it, right? And so I can sell my existing initial conditions. I can change that. So I can go and swap those tokens on Uniswap. There's probably not liquidity for one IP asset, but I can trade them to other people. I can bundle them up. I can do whatever I want with them, right? Like once it's in my wallet, it's tokenized and I can keep them and not do anything with them, in which case I just get the royalties. Or I could do DeFi and other interesting sort of maneuvers in order to get the most value out of that.
So for example, if someone's going to create a derivative NFT, instead of hard coding the split of the revenues into the NFT, like say Zora or 0x splits contract, they would make a reference to the ownership of the ERC20s, which it would then query in real time when revenues are generated, so that the ERC20s can change hands and the royalties will be allocated to the right people. Got it. And then I guess in the off-chain merchandising context, it's just up to following the law and maybe being enforced by courts.
Yeah, it's sort of. And so like a couple quick points on that. One is we've actually seen, think about like a Teespring or like a platform that allows you to create merch. Most merch is being created digitally these days anyways. Like there's a lot of digital platforms to create merch. And so these platforms, we talk to them, they're integrating with Story so that it's not perfect, right? Like I guess I could go and like print a t-shirt manually without using the internet at all. But if you're using any of these platforms and they're integrated with Story, those platforms know how much people pay for the merch, right? And so if I'm on a website selling Billie Eilish merch, that website knows how much they're earning because they can call, they're getting that through the web. And so essentially if they're integrating with Story's API, then that revenue can be funneled on-chain. Now, they do have to be honest, right? Because that revenue is coming in fiat rather than, on-chain assets. So that is sort of a stress point. But I do think, knowing how much royalties are coming in and integrating with these platforms and following the happy path, like that's a very powerful onboarding mechanism for off-chain revenue.
Do you imagine them doing some kind of content ID on the imagery that's being used? For example, in Teespring, if you use a Billie Eilish photo, that we might be able to use content ID technology, whatever. I'm just using that as a brand name, but just figure out who the photographer is, who owns the actual rights on Story, but based on the visual content rather than just like having to know the, ID number of the NFT corresponding to that IP asset.
Yeah, we've thought about building a sort of AI-powered content ID system, but right now it's more explicit, where you just have to specify in the API what ID what IP ID is what we call it that you're using, and so there's no automated mechanism right now, but that's definitely something that could be added as a layer on top. And to answer your question on enforcement, the way that we think about this is, you can right now use Story Protocol to raise disputes about IPs that you think are infringing, or are, if I just registered Mickey Mouse maliciously and I said I'm the creator, you can dispute that. And there are ways to essentially prevent royalty streams from accruing to disputed IPs. But really, the end all be all of it is the reason why the pill is so important, this programmable IP license, is that the worst case scenario on Story is the best case scenario today, right? If anyone violates your IP, how do you deal with that? Unfortunately, you have to use legal recourse. And so we try to avoid that as much as possible by building in these modules and enforcing things on chain. But in this off-chain scenario, if someone is just simply not doing what they said they would do, you still have that protection. You don't have to rely on just goodwill. You have a license. You can show people that license. You can get it enforced. And to be honest, that deters a lot of people from doing bad things because they know that exists. And Getty Images, you can go on Getty Images and right-click Save As, but it's still a $2 billion company of just stock photography, right? Because people, the New York Times it's not worth it for them to break the law to save $100 on a photo, right? And so we're basically building an on-chain Getty Images, but for the entire internet of content, and we're not tied to a single platform, right? So that's kind of how we think about it, and we think that having the programmable IP license really encourages people to follow this happy path, but still provides a backstop if people aren't following.
I'm interested because, for someone like Teespring, presumably it's not really in their interest to have to go through all the trouble to figure out whatever infringement. It's it doesn't affect them particularly. It affects maybe the creators of the original artwork, but I guess by having partnerships with both Teespring or someone like that, and I know you mentioned it in your talk, the digital creator, I don't know, it's a sort of DeviantArt kind of community or something like that. That maybe you can imagine it the way that websites used to have searching for Flickr Creative Commons imagery as a primitive built into a website for creating works. You might have derivatives from another partner of yours or someone who's integrated Story, so that there is that relationship. But I guess I'm curious, why does someone like Teespring, or what's the motivation? You can see the motivation amongst tools that are helping people create content, but if the content depends on derivatives, but the platform doesn't really pay, if it's an externality that they don't pay the price for, what is their interest in integrating something like Story?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, and you look at gaming, it's probably the most advanced form of IP, and every entertainment company wants to monetize like a gaming company because they just generate way more revenue. How are the most successful games, or the holy grail of gaming, what do they look like now? It's the Robloxes of the world, the Fortnites of the world. And what they've done successfully is create a UGC marketplace. Like Roblox created a platform, Minecraft created a platform, Fortnite created a platform for other people to create and monetize. And so if you're a Teespring, or if you're, any of these apps, one of the things you're thinking about is, how do I build a trust and community of creators to generate content that can then bring traction and volume and revenue to my platform? And so for Teespring, it's really important that you're creator first, that you're creator centric, and that you appropriately compensate those creators, because the best creators are going to be on the places where they can earn the most, right? And honestly, if you over time, you might be able to not enforce things or not use Story in the short term, but if artists are finding that all their work is being copied on Teespring, then that's going to develop a very bad reputation for the company, and they're going to be unable to bootstrap this essentially Legoland of IPs, or this UGC environment where people are staying on Teespring, they're creating on Teespring, they're creating for Teespring because they know that Teespring is going to treat them well. And so I think this is sort of a fundamental thesis of crypto in general, which is that your take rate is my opportunity. And for creators, what we're trying to do is make it easier for them to be aligned with the platform, where the platform isn't just taking from the creators, but the platform is actually giving to the creators, and that's good for the creators, it's good for the platform, and that builds a virtuous cycle that allows that network effect for a game like Roblox or for a platform like Teespring to have that community. And that's a real moat, right? Because in the era of AI generated content, I think content itself will be relatively cheap, but IP and origination will become very, very valuable, right? Because I can create anything in anyone's style, but what's really important is that, if I'm creating a Drake song, that Drake put his blue check mark on my song, right? Or The Weeknd put his blue check mark on my song, because anyone can create any random Drake song at this point. And so the authenticity and the sort of consent of the author becomes, valuable in the same way that counterfeits that look very, very similar are nowhere near as valuable as the original.
Yeah, it becomes important for distribution as the price of content generation tends towards zero, then influence only becomes more important. And so the imprimatur of the original creator is potentially a way to it will ultimately depend on how the recommendation algorithms do or don't privilege things. But I see what you mean. It does make me wonder, in what jurisdictions does Story Protocol, like, is it primarily situated in an American legal context because that's where IP origination is most important right now? Or does it apply globally? How can you think about jurisdictions if you're thinking about registering something on Story Protocol?
Yeah, jurisdictions is a really important topic. And the way we think about it, and luckily for us, is that copyright is at this point relatively globalized. And it's important that it is, because if Pikachu is created in Japan, I shouldn't be, no one should be able to use Pikachu randomly in the US just because it was created in Japan, right? So there have been international conventions essentially around copyright. And there's one called the Berne Convention, which is, like hundreds of countries got together and they decided, hey, let's follow the same basic set of rules. There might be some fine tuning. We might enforce them differently, but at the end of the day, we follow the same set of copyright principles. And so when we really focused on, the US and Asia as markets, and that's what we thought about when creating the programmable IP license. But we really want to emphasize that this is a global license and it can stand up anywhere. Practically anywhere that has essentially agreed to the Berne Convention, which at this point is every relevant country when it comes to IP. And so for all intents and purposes, the copyright license is global just because there are global standards around IP.
Got it. Story's success kind of depends on becoming like a Schelling point for IP rights on chain. I'm curious, I haven't heard of anything that's really doing anything quite like Story Protocol in an on-chain context, but do you think of any kind of competitors, or maybe not even competitors, but equivalent kind of attempts or efforts that have been made, maybe even in the traditional world, and that have failed? Is there anything like in the same lane as Story, or is it really the only project trying to do something like this?
Yeah, in the traditional world, I would say the closest, there's two types of comparisons, I would say. One is like an open version. I honestly see Story as an open version of like Meta Horizons, or like this metaverse concept that Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook like to talk about, which is basically let's bet on this trend that more and more digital assets or more value are moving into the digital world as opposed to the physical world. Right? That's essentially what the metaverse is from an economic perspective. And if you're Facebook, you want to capture that in one place. You want to capture that in that platform. That makes sense for you as a company. But if you're Story, we think, yes, we agree with the same thing. Like, more value is moving digitally, more value is occurring to ideas as opposed to physical goods. But can we make it an open substrate, right? Like, you have this global library of assets and things and IP, but anyone can use it, whether it's Meta Horizons or a small video game developer, right? So that's one comparison. Another comparison is more on the licensing side, which is, like we said before, like a Shutterstock or a Getty. I think that captures another element of it, which is, can we automate the monetization of IP, right? In many senses, that is licensing and that is royalties, right? So you combine the two together about automating through code some of the processes around monetizing IP, and then also bringing digital value into an underlying infrastructure. I think that's kind of where you land at Story. But there's no like direct correlate, I would say. And then in terms of the sort of on-chain world, I think the closest things are things like Story DAO, or things like NFT projects like Yuga Labs, like what they're trying to do. And what we see a lot, and honestly, how we got the idea for Story, one of them was we saw a lot of these efforts and we realized like they just didn't have the infrastructure to be truly composable, right? Like, think about how much work Luca and the Pudgy Penguins team, and props to them, had to put in to build Overpass, which is like a licensing platform for Pudgies. Our vision is that you shouldn't need to build a licensing platform. Like, you should just like you don't need to build a DEX for every ERC20 token. That's kind of absurd. So what we want to do is build the infrastructure that allows all of these interesting cultural experiments happening on chain to share the same tooling and to share the same like IP liquidity, so to speak, the same IP graph. And so I wouldn't even call them competitors. They're more like inspirations for us because we want to be able to power the next generation of these projects and these IPs without them needing to have the speed and scale of a Pudgy Penguins team that has the excellence to build their own licensing marketplace.
Makes sense. How will Story make money in the future?
Yeah, so it's a combination of a couple of things, but the main one is around protocol fees. So I think it was actually really interesting to see the Uniswap fee turn on a few months ago and be relatively successful. The way we think about it is, and this is all going to the treasury at the end of the day because we are decentralizing the protocol, and that's why we use blockchain at all, is because we don't want to be this holding company. Essentially, think about every IP licensing, remixing, monetization interaction as a transaction on Story. And these IP transactions or IP interactions carry monetary value. And so we just take a very small slice of all the value that's flowing through the system in the same way that, like you might have a tax on goods flowing in and out of a country. So that's kind of how we think about our business model is if people are monetizing IP, they're generating revenue on Story's facilitating that revenue, then we'll take a very, very small slice in the same way that Uniswap takes a very small fee on every swap that it facilitates.
And just to complete the Uniswap comparison, Uniswap is doing it on the front end currently. I guess they're also experimenting with doing it on certain pools in the protocol level, but you're talking about doing it at the protocol level.
We're talking about the protocol level. Yeah, exactly. But we can imagine like building maybe some first party apps that showcase the protocol, and then those apps could be but I think unlike Uniswap where the protocol is, if you ask what's being built on Uniswap, it's a DEX, right? Maybe it's a purple DEX or a green DEX, or it's a DEX with fewer or less buttons or more buttons, but it's a DEX. With Story, you can imagine powering something like Yuga. You can imagine powering like with some sort of AI focused tool, like a character AI. So there's not like one front end that we could build that would capture a lot of value. And I think the value for us is more on building this protocol that facilitates many different types of apps in an ecosystem style way.
Invisibly integrated into lots of different things. Your co-founders Sung-Yoon Lee and Jason Levy both have experience building these massive storytelling protocols, Radish and Episode, which are, I guess, UGC storytelling protocol platforms, Web 2, but maybe you can also think of them as like fanfic or maybe romance literature oriented kind of, but essentially UGC storytelling. At least that's how I understand it. First of all, how did you meet them? And second of all, how did that background influence Story? Because it seems to me like there's a lot of connective tissue, but these UGC storytelling platforms kind of don't get a lot of play in like the tech discussion circles.
Yeah. So I met SY, who we actually met through a mutual friend building in the crypto ecosystem. And so I got introduced through that mutual friend to SY, and we were both thinking about pretty much the same things. Like SY just sold his last company, which was as you mentioned, a very successful company called Radish, to Kakao, which is a Korean conglomerate. And he was very interested in how blockchain could solve some of the problems he faced as an operator in a Web2 media business. And then I was thinking about, like I said, how come there's so much financial infrastructure, but very little creative infrastructure in crypto? And so I have a more of like a research and product and engineering mind. He has a very business and sort of media entertainment mind. And so it was very obvious that we should work together. And then Jason is someone that SY has known for a long time because they both built companies in similar industry, right? In the sort of mobile storytelling industry. And so they had known each other, and Jason has a really great mind for essentially, how do we take this ancient craft of storytelling and translate it for the blockchain era in the same way that he did for the mobile era? Because every new technology moves content forward, and arguably entertainment is sort of always the first to change in a new technological paradigm shift. So that's kind of how we got to know each other. And as you said, like, I think there's a lot of good synergies between the founding team in terms of having that experience in entertainment, having that experience in technology, but being, having the shared vision of building infrastructure for a new era of creativity that is powered by AI, that is powered by the internet, that is powered by social media. And right now we're still using essentially the same IP tooling, which is pen and paper, as people invented 400 years ago after the Gutenberg press, right? So we're still kind of trying to apply that to the internet, and it's not working. So that's kind of how the company got started.
Yeah, I'm particularly interested. I mean, both of their backgrounds, and particularly SY's background, both doing Radish and then also working at Kakao, which acquired Radish subsequently, seems to me like it seems natural enough that you'll be able to establish partnerships with kind of UGC creator platforms that are interested in engaging with Story Protocol in order to sort of broaden their offering. But the Kakao connection also strikes me as potentially answering the big question, the big skepticism people might have about something like Story Protocol, which is how do you convince big brands to actually put their IP on chain? Because it's a huge risk for them. Nobody wants to do it first, presumably. But I imagine that the connections that he has and the sort of understanding of their perspective of the industry may help you achieve that. Is there any light you can shed on how you're going to manage to convince big IP holders to put their content on chain?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, we're working with some pretty large creators right now in Hollywood. And like I mentioned, some platforms that have millions of users. So we're definitely starting to get that adoption and that traction and that interest. That being said, our belief is that every new content platform that's truly revolutionary starts by engaging with the long tail of creators that were neglected by the previous system, right? And I think the canonical example here is YouTube, where YouTube didn't start and they go to Steven Spielberg or James Cameron in Hollywood and say, hey, we have this video platform that you can share videos on the internet. They went to the guys who just got phones, either whatever, iPhone 3GS or whatever, and they're in their bedroom creating home videos that look like really that. And they look like, just kind of toys, right? This idea that everything that's important eventually starts initially looking like a toy, right? And so YouTube got this whole class of creators that just could not have existed without YouTube, that were completely neglected by Hollywood, and they started creating videos on YouTube, right? And that's what led to Mr. Beast today. And so we have a similar thesis. It's like, is it really the teams that already are generating millions in revenue and have teams of lawyers and know how to manage IP? Is it really them that they're going to be the most desperate and feeling the most pain? It's probably not. I mean, it's very encouraging that we have like people in Hollywood who are very excited about this. And it just goes to show like how powerful this is and also the need for change in that industry. But we really are focused on crypto native use cases, IPFi, AI, tokenizing creativity, because honestly, I think that's where we're really focused, is the people who just did not even know they had IP and certainly could not do anything with it. Those are the people that are going to do the most interesting things and going to be the most motivated to use and build on Story. And so even though we do have this advantage, this unfair advantage that we have connections to Webtoons and Wattpad and these big platforms in Hollywood, like the real focus for us is to be pragmatic and to really look at who's going to be the most creative with our tech and who's going to want it the most and who's going to get the most benefit from it. And we think that's this 99.9% of people creating content on social media or using AI that understand crypto. And so we're starting there. And hopefully that can show, once there's success stories there, we can show that to the bigger players, and that'll sell them more than any picture on the technology can.
Awesome. Jason, I know you got to run. Thank you so much for sharing all this great information about Story Protocol. We got through almost all of my questions, which is a good start. If people want to check out more, where should they keep tuned to the Story Protocol story? Yeah,
so you could follow us on Twitter at Story Protocol, and then my handle is at Jason J Zhao. That's ZHAO. So I'll be sharing as many updates as we can. And we have some exciting updates in the coming weeks, so stay tuned.
Very cool. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Nicholas. Appreciate you.
Hey, thanks for listening to this episode of Web3 Galaxy Brain. To keep up with everything Web3, follow me on Twitter at Nicholas with 4 leading N's. You can find links to the topics discussed on today's episode in the show notes. Podcast feed links are available at web3galaxybrain.com. Web3 Galaxy Brain airs live most Friday afternoons at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, 2200 UTC on Twitter Spaces. I look forward to seeing you there.